So first I have to apologise, I'm not an engineer. I know that offends most of you. So to appease that, I tried to write a formula. Now, if any of you can work that out, A, I'll give you 10 grand, because B, you really should be in rehab, you're on drugs. It's totally made up. 26 plus 1. This is probably the most important thing I'm going to say tonight. There were 26 studies to try and get light rail through the centre of Sydney, done prior to my arriving at the City of Sydney. There were some $12 million spent on those 26 reports, all of which filled this very beautiful shelf in the City Library. And my job was, on contract, to get light rail up. I was rather deflated when I walked into the library and looked at the shelf, and then something twigged. Every single one of those reports said exactly how you could deliver light rail in central Sydney. Grade, camber, drainage, alignment, traction. There wasn't a single word on why you would bother. Why would you actually put light rail through the centre of Sydney? Why would you pull a city apart? Why would you take the main road of Sydney out and change its function? And that's all I did. I just wrote a report that said why. Why? Because we want a better place. Why? Because we've actually destroyed the place with buses. We had businesses closing down because they could not get business. The main street of Sydney, it had the lowest rent value of a main street in Australia, in the biggest city. The streets adjacent had rents twice per square metre because the noise from the buses, the fumes from the buses, the visual impact of the buses, you couldn't even see across the street. You did not know where the street began and where the street ended because you saw this line of buses. I came up with this lovely phrase, the conga line of buses, and I put that into the Lord Mayor's head, and that hit the media, and a year later we started to get approvals. A lot of fun for a non-engineer. I love these fake equations. 3 rails. Why 3 rails? We had a problem in the centre of Sydney. We had a lot of historic buildings, very low-rise buildings, very degraded buildings, literally falling apart. Previously, there had been light rail up George Street. And the points of attachment for the catenary were on those buildings. But the very reason that we could get this thing up was it was going to revitalise the entire main street of Sydney. So they were going to pull all those buildings down. We did not want to actually attach any catenary, any critical infrastructure to buildings that were already expired. So we, had a quick whip round the world and we tried to find the way of having wireless light rail over a 3-kilometre span, which is not out of question, but unfortunately most of it is uphill. And it got to be quite difficult. We initially settled on battery pack on the tram with flash charging at the stations. And then when somebody who could actually add up, not me, did the calcs, we worked out that we would run out of power if it was a hot day. If you had the air conditioner on full belt and you had a full load, you just wouldn't get there. So we went with the very expensive third rail system instead. And it's only live when the tram is over it, so we don't electrocute people like we used to. Good engineering stuff. But it did add a significant amount to the cost. 45-metre sets. The whole system was designed around 45-metre sets because they're like standard things that you buy off the shelf from those people with shops online. I want to buy a light rail set, 45 metres. Yeah, I'll have 6 of those. Problem was, don't carry enough people. We couldn't work out how to get traffic across a corridor and run light rail along a corridor with 45-metre sets. So we thought, we're bold. We're the City of Sydney, we can do anything we want. We'll have 90-metre sets. We'll take 2 45-metre sets and we'll put them together. And this seemed like a wild idea, like all the numbers looked fantastic, you could carry everybody. Then we realised some blocks in Sydney are only 78 metres long. Bloody engineers. Every time they find a reason not to do the simple thing. So we solved that later with 67 metre sets, and I'll talk about those in a minute, because there's a little bit of a problem there. And then we had the 2 squared problem. 2 standards, 2 contracts. The 2 standards are very interesting. Now, there's this city down here, Melbourne, we refer to it as Mexico when we're in Sydney, but down here we say it's a wonderful European, Parisian type city with lots of light rail. And you know what you're doing, and you have a standard, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's one of the few standard sets that I've read that go, well, that makes sense, that's what you would do. So, of course, New South Wales decided not to adopt it. In not adopting that standard, even though it was what was recommended, we spent $1 billion. Think about standards. As young engineers, I encourage you to actually think about the application of standards and why they exist. They don't just pop up. These are things that take years to evolve. Many very smart people spend a lot of time refining those standards. Over decades, they become brilliant things. They can be annoying because they stop you doing things like 90 metre sets. But they're there for a reason. They give you certainty. You can make decisions knowing what is going to happen. No, New South Wales decided to use the heavy rail standard for light rail on the street. Which means the slab has to be much, much thicker. And when you have a heavy rail train station only 400 millimetres below the surface of the street, this gets to be a little bit tricky. When you need to put the traction in, you have to be able to push a full tram with another full tram up the steepest part of the slope, because that's the heavy rail standard. You suddenly have so much redundancy built into your system. You have so much more traction, so much bigger motors that you need in your carriage. Just ridiculous. So that was a bit of blind idiocy. But that wasn't the biggest mistake. The biggest mistake was the squared. So we said we would have 2 contracts. This is George Street. This is 150 or almost 200-year-old street. Every service that has ever been delivered in Sydney has been run down George Street and then speared off. Sydney is 3 kilometres long and only 800 metres wide. George Street's in the middle. You put all the crap down the middle, you spear it off to the edges. Makes sense. Unfortunately, that means every single service in a heavy rail standard has to be moved from underneath the track. You can't have a single service under the track. And we said, well, if you're going to do that, sure, but we would highly recommend that you have 2 contracts. One to shift the services, and when you know you've done it, get somebody just to throw the stuff on the surface and put the little train set on it, make it run up and down, and hey, it'll be easy. And you'll get it for a lot less. And when we did the great project management thing and the time frame, it turned out that if we did the 2 contracts, we would go past an election date by 3 months. So they put them together. And now they're 2 years past the election date and they're overdue, and it's cost them $1 billion additional to the original budget. We discovered services that were not on any plan. So we potholed every metre for 3 kilometres, and we still discovered services that we did not know about. And we discovered things that we weren't meant to know about. I don't know if you know that what do we, I suppose we call them, the domestic spying agencies actually have communications systems in our cities and they don't tag them. How do you know they're there? Well, when you cut them to find out who owns them. I was the brave project manager who said do that. I was the one who wore the outcome. Men in suits. So it all adds up to yikes dollars, which is a very technical term for more than the budget can withstand. Now, that B is a good B. That's a 13 billion. That's a positive. It's got a big plus in front of it. That was wonderful. To get this thing over the line, we spoke to every business in Sydney, not every transport planner, but every business in Sydney, and said, why don't you want to be on George Street? And they said, well, it's a hole. Why don't you want to be in Pitt Street, which is the most expensive real estate in Australia? Well, because it's becoming a Westfield and we want to be associated with something of a higher value, a different brand statement. And it's placemaking. We spoke to the people in Castlereagh Street where we have the very shishi shops that sell things that I don't understand for money that I can't afford. And they said, well, we'd like to be on George Street, but at the moment we wouldn't go anywhere near George Street. So we said, well, our concept is we take the vehicles out, we put light rail in, it's people. And they said we would invest there. Within 9 months of announcing this plan starting, we had $13 billion of pre-DAs lodged at the City of Sydney for that corridor. The property transactions went through the roof. Everybody was making hay. And with that, we convinced the state government that they should sign off on the delivery of this project because business realised that it wasn't a fantasy, a soft placemaking thing. It was a real thing about being a real place that people would inhabit. And when people inhabit place, economically, they spend money. But they were $220 million short in the budget. $220 million. And I worked for a little local government and I was like, that's a lot of money for our little local government, $220 million. But then I added up what the rates would be for the uplift that came from the $13 billion worth of investment, went, hey, we're going to make a profit out of this. So we had a big public meeting. The council agreed to support it on very strict condition about the quality of the placemaking that went ahead. That topped up the budget. We were called idiots, dummies for being taken for a ride by the state government. But we limited our liability at $220 million, and they went from $1.2 billion to $2.7 billion, and the city still hasn't paid its $220 million because I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But the result is this thing is being tested in operation now, end to end, despite all of the horror of the delivery mechanism and the ridicule that it has delivered upon the state government trying to deliver this as a key project. The reality is it will fundamentally change the nature of the centre of the biggest city in Australia. It will increase the space that people have to occupy in their city. Often we had footpaths of only 1.8 metres on the main street of Sydney, and now they're going to have 10 metres to roam. And in fact, while the light rail has not been operating, people have just been walking all over this thing and just, it has been, remember those protests, Occupy? They've occupied George Street. It's been incredible. Businesses have already opened. They're making huge profits. Sure, there have been little gnarly bits that have been sort of pulling at the edges and annoying people. Ignore it. Because in any major project, disruption, disruption, disruption. I had a minister say to me the most brilliant thing ever. He was a really idiotic minister, but he said the most brilliant thing to me ever. He said, all change is fantastic so long as it doesn't happen to you. And that's the public attitude to development. 67 metre sets. They are freaking huge. They're 4 metres shorter than the jumbo jet. They're going to take a little while to get past you. And they are very, very quiet. So we've had a few people be knocked over by these things, even in testing mode already. And we're just playing with, different sounds and lights and things to warm, because we're just not used to having on-street vehicles in pedestrian areas. But the reason we need those 67 metre sets is we're taking 182 buses an hour out of the CBD and transferring all of those people onto light rail. Those 182 buses, are just causing hell in the city. Taking them out would be brilliant. But they were going to be 90, so I think it's a win. Here's just a couple of pics of what happens when you let, I'm going to swear now, engineers do urban design. This is why the city has not paid the money. People are falling over the thing all over the place because there's not enough contrast. the ground surface, tactile ground surface indicators, the lumpy bits, weren't put on the edges, so we've had visually impaired people falling over and breaking their ankles. But all of the actual stuff that makes the train runs beautiful. This is how narrow George Street is. Yeah, there's just not much room. That is Wynyard Station on the right. That is the second busiest station in Australia on your right. There's 1.5 metres between the light rail and the entrance to the station. It's a tight corridor. You talked about a tight corridor? We had a tight corridor as well. Well, this is just my nightmare. This is why, when I was the project manager for the city, I wouldn't sign off on the money. What the hell is that? Apparently that's urban design resolved. So, anybody who wants to go out there and show them what colour contrast looks like and that grey is not the only colour in the palette, feel free. That's me.